Welcome to Solutions Rising. I'm Rachel Branch, and each time I am always so honored and happy that Mr. H. John Fisher has come to join us for another really extraordinary program on housing and all the housing needs. And we did a program, our last program was Housing 101, a workshop that he gives at every Fair Housing and Civil Rights Conference. And we called it Housing 101 Plus, and now we're doing Housing 101 Plus 2, and we're going to continue that and go into some other topics also. And this is an ongoing series, actually, it's turned into with John, and we always do one on the Fair Housing and Civil Rights Conference, and we will be doing one again in the upcoming 18th conference in April of 2024. So here we go. Welcome, John.
Oh, hello. Nice to see you again, Rachel.
Always the same with you. And we could start right where we left off and go right on with what you tell at the workshop, Housing 101.
Okay, actually, this is almost 2 workshops. What really people sometimes mix together are their so-called fair housing rights, and these are their essentially civil rights that everyone has.
And legal rights.
And then there are also the legal rights.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, the fair housing rights are absolutely legal rights and absolutely protected by law. But then, aside from that particular category, there also are just some rights that one has as a, as a tenant or somebody who's buying a house or going out for a loan or something like that. And so the last time we talked, I really tried to go over the fair housing rights because these are basic, really, essentially, it's codifying human rights. I mean, everyone should have a place to live that's safe, that's, that they can feel secure in. And those are, again, they are legal rights. The federal laws, which are sort of the overarching, they apply throughout the country, have what's called protected categories. And a protected category is just if you cannot have somebody refuse to rent to you, refuse to sell to you, refuse to give you a loan, in any way treat you differently based on the fact that you might fall into certain categories. And again, the big 7, if you will, the national ones are race, color, national origin, religion, sex, and again, sex is not just your birth sex, it also implies things like your gender identity or your sexual preference, that kind of thing. Family status, what your family makeup is, and if you have a disability. And the piece with a disability is if you have a disability, it is legitimate to ask that what's called a reasonable accommodation be made to that disability. In other words, that there needs to be some sort of affirmative step that somebody takes to sort of even the playing field, if you will, so that that disability should not interfere with your right to rent a house, to buy a house, to take out a loan. Those are the basic federal ones. Massachusetts also has a whole series of their own. Probably one of the key ones people need to know is if somebody has a rental subsidy of some sort, whether that's a Section 8, the federal program, Mass Rental Voucher Program, or if somebody's source of income might be, for example, either disability or aid for children or something of that nature, because sometimes even if somebody can afford something, they still get discriminated against just because of the source of their income. So that really can't be taken into it. That's the Massachusetts version. The Connecticut version is even a little wider. It simply says regardless of where your income comes from.
Which appears to be better than
I think it's probably a little bit. They're both trying to do the same thing, but it may be a little bit stronger in the way they do it. And as I say, these are the state, kind of the additional state regulations that come into there too. So that's almost a recap of what we talked about last time. Again, the important thing really with a disability is somebody who has a disability has the right to request a reasonable accommodation, whatever that might be. It might be allowing an emotional support animal. It might be, might be as much as talking about ramps to get into a building, or strobe light smoke detectors and doorbells if you are hearing impaired, that kind of thing. But they have a right to request that reasonable accommodation be made, so long as it does not place, and again, the term is an undue financial or administrative burden upon whoever's giving the reasonable accommodation, be that the person selling a house, a landlord, a lender, what have you. And those are really basically you're really bottom, fair housing, civil rights that apply across the board to everybody. So that's, as I say, that's what we talked about the first time. Now the second one, this is a little bit more specific, but it's important that people know about these things too. If you are a tenant, and this is really speaking now specifically with the tenant-landlord relationship, but that's obviously a very important one. You also have certain rights and responsibilities in both directions. Tenants to landlords, landlords to tenants. Massachusetts is a state that has particularly strong protections for tenants. But I think the first thing to understand, really the starting point, is to understand that legally speaking in Massachusetts, there are two types of tenancies, okay? There is essentially what's called a tenant for years, and that's where somebody has a written contract called, and the term is, that's what's called a lease. The term lease gets kind of used to mean anything, and it's not. It's very specific. A lease is a written contract between the landlord and the tenant where each of them is promising the other one that during a certain period of time, generally it's for residential properties, it's usually a year, but it could be longer, it could be less.
It's a legal document.
It's literally a legal document. It's literally something people can hold in their hands and read, and this spells out the stuff. That's number one. And number two is it is an agreement that you're going to abide by that document for a set period of time. In other words, the lease shall run from whatever, the 1st of September 2023 until the 31st of August 2024. So it's a set period of time. During that time, the only reason that either party is supposed to end it is if the other party has somehow materially violated that agreement. So for example, if you're a tenant and the landlord doesn't supply heat, certain things are required. If you rent a property in Massachusetts, it has to have certain things in it. There's this basic state sanitary code and some building codes that apply. So it has to have heat, it has to have hot water, it has to be secure, it has to, there has to be ventilation. I mean, just the basic things that make something livable. So if, for example, the landlord violates that by not fixing the heat or whatever, not fixing the roof if it's a leaking roof or something of that nature, then that theoretically gets the tenant out of that agreement. But otherwise, the landlord is bound by it. And the landlord during that period of time can't raise the rent, can't change any of the deal, if you will, any of the stuff that people have actually come and agreed to. So that's one type of tenancy. The other type of tenancy is what's called a tenancy at will. That's a year-to-year tenancy. And that agreement can be either verbal, it can be literally as simple as, I pay you whatever, I pay you $950, you give me the keys to the apartment, and we've created a tenancy just like that.
It's an oral contract.
It's an oral contract.
Legal.
It's still legal, still
Yeah.
binding, but it's oral, or it can be in writing. But the difference between that is it doesn't have an ending date. If you wanted to really talk about it, a tenancy for years, a tenancy with a lease, is almost like you've gotten married. You've committed to each other for a set period of time. If you will, it's a marriage with an automatic divorce at the end, unless you do a new lease. But a tenancy at will is more like you're just kind of hanging out together. In other words, it's month to month usually.
Usually when a lease runs out, if you stay and don't sign a second lease.
You become a
it turns
tenant
it
at
in-
will.
Yes.
Turns into a tenant at will.
And that happens a lot where
Yeah.
people fulfill the first year and then go on and
Right,
stay.
absolutely. I mean, what really happens is that the first, you're first almost getting to know each other. And if it's been good for both parties over a period of time, you almost don't notice when the leases run out because it's working well for everybody.
Yeah.
But basically, there's a real difference because with the tenancy at will, and again, it can be in writing. People will sometimes look at the document that creates a tenancy at will, which is called a rental agreement. And it looks just like a lease, except that it doesn't have an ending date. It says, beginning the 1st of September, these shall be the things we agree to. With a lease, that means you're locked into those things for a set period of time. Tenancy at will, which is either verbal or in writing, doesn't have an ending date. So in that case, it becomes what's called a month-to-month tenancy. And either the landlord or the tenant has the right to terminate it simply by giving the other one a written notice. And that notice has to be given such that there's always a full rental period, which is really, let's say, there's a full period from the time that the tenant pays the rent until he or she moves out. That will always be within the notice period. So if I were giving you, for example, a notice to quit, a notice terminating our tenancy at will, I wouldn't have to have a reason. I wouldn't need to show cause. Or if you were, as a tenant, wanted to leave me, you wouldn't need to give a reason or show cause. But just simply say, hey, I'm leaving. So long as that, by the time you're leaving, allows for one full rental period, one full period from when you pay your rent, usually at the first of the month, to the end of the month when you move out. Again, non-payment of rent is a different thing. That's really a collection device. And we really get in the weeds over that. But the basic difference, and it's very important for people to understand that, is a basic difference is if you have a lease, the lease implies commitment and security for both parties for a set period of time. A month-to-month tenancy, which is probably the most common, is just simply, these are the rules, we're going to stick with them, but either of us has a right to kind of end it if we want to. And so they're very different, and there are different rules that apply to each of them, so that it's really kind of important people understand that. But that's the basic right anyway.
And we've watched the fair housing regulations and civil rights regulations evolve over the years, and the discrimination of different groups of people, such as LGBTQ plus. We've watched those added, rightfully and necessarily so, but still. Today, with the dire housing needs, we have to talk a little bit about, I think, what happens when landlords are moving tenants out because they can make especially for subsidized housing, because they can make so much more renting. I mean, what's happening in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and across the country?
Across the country.
Yes, with the huge rents. I mean, this is a dire crisis.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, of course, there's been inflation, but this is far more than just what's going on. And actually, the inflation, it's very interesting. I'm old enough to remember back when inflation was double digit for a while.
We are old enough.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
but
18%, 20%.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. It was, and stop and think about what that is in terms of today. It's much less. But in any event, it still was there. And you had a very strange situation where everything was held static during COVID. Essentially people weren't moving out, just because they have health reasons and what have you. Landlords essentially weren't allowed to evict in Massachusetts. That's not totally true, but it was 99.9% true. And
Which
so
was
after
necessary at that time.
it was a public health thing. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It was. It definitely was there. But I think a bunch of things happened. And to be fair, from the landlord's point of view, as I think I said before, landlords got scared, and they got the sense that, and as a matter of fact, it's still a much slower and more difficult process to evict somebody today than it was before COVID. And some of them, for example, are taking apartments literally off the market because they don't want to rent them, or they essentially raise the prices, and for two reasons. Obviously, you make more money. I understand that incentive, but also it really is there, in quotes, looking for the tenant who's making so much money and pays so much money, and it just pushes people out. And because once that freeze, where you sort of couldn't move anywhere, once that went away, the market suddenly just flew open, and so that it's all become much harder. Rents are up a great deal, and there are some landlords who really are taking advantage of it, and the demand is so much higher now. It really outstrips the availability of apartments. Add on to that fact that at least during COVID, there was some semblance of help if someone fell behind in their rent. The major, at least in Massachusetts, I just came back from a national conference in Denver and saw the same thing, that the amount of subsidy that's available now has been really cut back. And so that the help is really not there. The levels of subsidies for programs like Section 8 and, again, Mass Rental Voucher Program, which is a state program very similar to Section 8, all of those things are just less. And with the rents going up and the subsidies not there, and then the emergency monies having been cut back and limited in terms of what's available for people who might have lost their jobs or something of that nature, although it's hard to evict them, the process is slower, it's going to happen. It just means it takes longer. It's the dropping the frog in boiling water versus dropping the frog in water that gradually heats up. At some point, even if it's a slower eviction process, which of course is harder on the landlords too, but if it's a slower eviction process and there's no help, sooner or later people are homeless.
Well, this actually leads into affirmatively furthering fair housing, but I find even this conversation quite frightening, actually, and the lack of, they talk nationally and in the media about single-family homes, and yet I think, why are we not talking about rehabilitating homes that can be turned into cooperative properties that people can own and be part of? And this is not a beat up on the landlord. This is about fair housing and being fair to landlords and tenants. But if people, there's a section of people that they just want to make money. There's a section of people. But we have very vulnerable communities in this country that are suffering horrifically. I'm very concerned in Massachusetts that the governor would veto a program for community action centers. I mean, I was a recipient of that, and the energy audits, the programs that they have. I don't understand that at all. And these are governmental responsibilities that must be addressed. So,
Yeah. I mean, I think to some extent, you've had, at least during COVID, some interesting stuff that happened and some level of commitment to stuff, but it is really the rationale. I think that's probably the rationale on some of those cutbacks. I mean, in fairness, the Massachusetts budget has increased the money available for the rental assistance programs for, emergency if people have fallen behind, although the amount you can get is still less than what you would have gotten before. But yeah, I mean, there's a sense of, oh, well, the emergency is over, therefore we don't have to worry about it. The emergency was there all along.
yes.
Yeah.
And COVID is still with us.
And COVID is still with us
Yes.
too.
You could say it's over, a president could say it's over. It is not over.
Yeah. It is, I mean, obviously that the lockdown period seems to have been over. COVID is in an awful way, very much like flu did after the great pandemic of 100 years ago, kind of sort of learned to live with us is a horrible way of putting it, but
Yes,
but
it's
basically that
talking.
is so. But it's yeah, unfortunately it's a reality we still have to deal with. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean I think there's certainly, if you look at the statistics, there was a study done in Hampden and Hampshire and I believe Franklin counties, done through the Donahue Institute at the University of Massachusetts, and actually my company I work with, my nonprofit I work with, Wayfinders, was very much involved in this. And what it really outlines is that it's in many ways the same problem. If you go into the really heavy urban area, the Metro Boston, for example, on the one hand, the rents are much higher. By and large, income levels may be a little bit higher too. But if you go back to, again, that area of the state, and I know the same thing is happening here in Berkshire County too, so that really, although the rents may not be as high as they are in Boston, the ability of people to pay is also brought down, so that you have the same problem, that the supply definitely doesn't meet the need. And that's kind of an ongoing problem. And it really does. What I would love to see is some real action, really from everybody, kind of together on this.
It has to be. And I don't know how you encourage that, but I do know when I made a comment I created my own acronym for affirmatively furthering fair housing. I said TAPE.
Yeah.
Transparency, accountability, protection, and enforcement. That's
a lovely term,
right
yeah.
There.
Yeah.
It's right there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Oh yeah,
I had
absolutely.
quite fun
Yeah,
creating
copyright it, and then you can make a lot of money out of it. That's sort of sometimes the approach. Yeah, and again, I mean, it's interesting because affirmatively furthering fair housing, when federal monies are involved, there is a rule. The basic concept of AFFH is essentially that you don't just not do the wrong thing, that you should be always thinking about what's the right thing I can do.
And I always start in that reference point, I always start, if you think about a child or a baby first, how can you mess up thinking about what is really important? If you think about what a baby or a child needs and come out from there,
Yeah,
it's very easy to
yeah,
be able to formulate policies that are effective and working and can evolve.
Right. Well, again, in terms of the federal regulation, it really, any municipality, any nonprofit, any agency, anyone receiving federal money having to do with housing in one way or another is supposed to be always working in that way, working with that thought. The rules were actually, there was some very specific guidance that you had at one point, and then it was really, it sort of got withdrawn, if you will, around 2016. And now after 2020, they've been working again to try and rethink these, which on the one hand is always the idea of more regulation, but that regulation is really there to sort of help people, give some guidance about this is what you really need to be doing. Because people don't, sometimes it just doesn't occur to you. If you don't have any disabilities, if you've never experienced racism, if you've never experienced, poverty, there really isn't. There's a certain ignorance you have. It's not necessarily cognitive ignorance. I mean, you might have heard this explained, but it's not visceral. You don't really understand what it is. So that's the reason for those guidance.
I never thought about that because they weren't exposed to it.
Well, because not being exposed to it, it doesn't even occur to people sometimes that this is something they should be doing. Yeah. So in that sense, and I think hopefully the new Stronger AFFH, when it comes out, I keep saying it's going to come out soon, it will, may provide some guidance in that direction.
But I think those of us on the local level and in organizations like yours have to keep raising our voices and giving input into that so that it comes from the local right up to the top.
Absolutely.
And here we are again.
Here we are again.
Here we are again. And please come back in another month or two. And this obviously is an ongoing, very important topic. And I just never can thank you enough for being a guest on Solutions Arriving and everything that you bring. And I want to thank Dave Fabiano, Executive Director, and Nicole Brown, Director of Solutions Rising, for continuing to support us on Solutions Rising and its airing. And if each one of us pick up one problem and solve it, imagine the incredible view we would all have of Solutions Rising. Please be part of the solution, and I hope you will learn from the program that H. John Fisher has just provided us with so much information for, as he always does on Solutions Rising. Thank you.